Good morning, everyone. My name is Julie Ty. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters and the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. We are a statewide environmental advocacy and civic organization that seeks to engage and empower New Yorkers about the environment and educating them so that they can help advance environmental progress through the civic process. Thank you for joining us this morning and for spending your Monday with us for what should be a very enlightening program. Before we get started, I'd like to thank AIA for hosting us in this beautiful space. We're all commenting on the fact that you have this wonderful light, even though we're down in the basement. And a big thank you to our friends from Con Edison for their partnership and for sponsoring today's event. As New York transitions to electrifying its transportation and building sectors, we really have to take into consideration the readiness of our grid and how resilient our infrastructure is. That's why we have a wonderful panel this morning of cross-sector experts who will discuss the transmission and distribution infrastructure needs and what's in store for our electric future. They'll also talk about what their respective organizations are doing to help the city and the state achieve its clean energy goals. So I want to thank all of our panelists. We have Carl Moss from NYSERDA, we have Chris Casey from NRDC, we have Jen Hensley from Con Edison, and we have Kevin Lanahan from the NYSO, or the New York System Independent Operator. And Sam, our moderator from the city, will do a little bit more bios on each of our speakers. I think most of you know, if you're here today, that the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is the nation's strongest and most comprehensive climate law, mandating that the state achieve 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% emissions-free power by 2040. This week, we're taking a big step forward as New York's first offshore wind project starts to come online, which is a very exciting step after many, many years of waiting. But clean energy is kind of the easy part, which is hard to imagine, because we know, especially I think Chris and I, who've been advocating in the trenches to try and get progress here, how hard that is. But the climate law really goes much further and requires the entire economy across all sectors to reduce emissions 85% by 2050 and to endeavor to be carbon neutral. That is a lot. In the top of those lists, as we mentioned sort of at the start of this, is of course the transportation and building sectors. For them to go carbon free in large part relies on the grid to be green. Buildings are one of the leading sources of greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in the state, and they account for nearly 2/3 of the emissions here in New York City. We have to decarbonize buildings as a major role to meet our emissions reductions. This year we've passed some laws that are going to put impacts on the grid, including new All-Electric Buildings Act for new construction, passed in the state budget earlier this year. We're working hard to deploy efficient thermal energy networks to help transition how we heat and cool our buildings. That's a new technology, new to the United States, and a network technology. Of course, New York City has been ahead of the curve. How many people here have heard of Local Law 97? Yeah, exactly. This is a Local Law 97 friendly room. We've been looking at how are we going to deal with our existing buildings, because there's so much building stock, and that's going to help us drive emissions reductions and energy efficiency. And of course, Local Law 154, which requires all electric buildings here in New York City for new construction a little bit faster than for the state. On the other side, in the rest of the state, they do not have the lovely, wonderful, large mass transit system that we have here in New York City. Transportation is really the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in the rest of the state, and it is the second highest source of greenhouse gas emissions overall, accounting for nearly 1/3 of our state's emissions. So that's a lot we're getting from transportation. As many of you may have read in the New York Times this morning, or at least in their little email that they send out, we are really closer than ever to actually implementing congestion pricing for the first time in our nation, because we know we can't drive our way out of the climate crisis. The mayor has unveiled a plan to electrify all of their vehicles. That's over 100,000 vehicles in the city. Statewide, we're going to require all sales and leases of new light-duty passenger vehicles in New York to be zero emission by 2035, and all medium and heavy-duty vehicles by 2045. We got a really exciting law that requires all of our school buses to be electric by 2035. So we have all these laws in place that are going to decarbonize these two big portions of the economy, and we know 2040 and 2050 are going to be here before we know it, especially when you're talking about planning for infrastructure. We know this all takes a long time. We're going to have new battery storage be part of that solution to help us increasing the reliability of the grid and helping us shut down the dirty power plants that are polluting our communities. So we know that all of this is happening. We're going to be changing dramatically how we power our world. It's going to look very different in 2030 and in 2040 and in 2050 than it does today. So what does that mean for our energy infrastructure? The bottom line is we're going to be putting a lot more reliance onto the electric grid. We're going to be requiring a lot more electricity from new energy sources. That means we're going to need new and more energy infrastructure in new places and a whole lot of new technology, some of which we may not even know about today. So that's what we're here to discuss, and I know we're looking forward to learning more about it from our expert panel. So thank you all for joining us. Now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Samantha Maldonado. Samantha is a senior reporter for The City, where she covers climate and resiliency. She previously covered energy for Politico New Jersey and New York, and her reporting has also appeared in the Associated Press and on CNN. She's a graduate of the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY and Wesleyan University. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Maldonado.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for coming and for being here. I'm Samantha Maldonado, as Julie said in the introduction. I work for The City, which is a nonprofit independent news outlet, only online. You can find us at thecity.nyc. Sometimes it's confusing because it sounds like the government. It is not. But anyway, again, thank you so much for joining us today. You'll find on your seat some index cards, or maybe just one, that you can write down questions that you have for me or for any of the panelists. We'll get to those a little bit later today. So yeah, I'm here with 4 people from different areas and different sectors of the industry. Julie set us up great for why we're here and sort of what's at stake moving forward with our decarbonization goals and the big electrification wave that we are going to see and need to see, frankly, to be able to combat the climate crisis and to meet our legally mandated goals under the NYLCV. That's the, let's see if I can do it on a Monday morning. Is it Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act? I believe that's right. All right. And so what I'll do by way of introduction is I'd love to go down the row and have each person sort of introduce themselves, but more importantly, how they themselves in the sector that they're in are working to beef up the grid and how they're coming at electrification, if that makes sense. So if we want to start with Chris Casey from NRDC.
Hi, I'm Chris Casey from NRDC. I co-lead our climate and clean energy work in New York, and I am particularly focused on the work that goes before the Public Service Commission, and I am also our lead at the NYSO. And so I kind of work on utility issues all day, every day, particularly electric and natural gas.
Those are our issues. I'm Jen Hensley, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Con Edison. I handle all of our intergovernmental, community, regulatory, and communications, as well as our philanthropy and strategic partnerships. And for Con Edison, really, our role is about delivering clean energy and making sure that we can meet the demand of the increased need for electricity in the building and transportation sectors, as well as the economic growth of our service territory, which is New York City's 5 boroughs, Westchester County, and we also have a utility in Orange and Rockland County.
Great, thank you. Great to see everyone here. An early morning turnout is fantastic. I'm Carl Maas. I'm our Vice President at NYSERDA for Policy Analysis and Research. I think most folks probably know NYSERDA, but you may think of us as those who are out there handing out incentives. A major hat we wear, and that's my primary hat, is around energy planning. And so we are effectively the energy office for the state. So we lead our energy planning every 4 years, and most recently our climate action scoping plan. And for those who followed that online, there was probably a little bit of Groundhog Day because I was up on screen talking about the plan over and over again. And today I'm here to talk about some of our infrastructure needs and transmission.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs, Corporate Communications at the New York Independent System Operator. Probably a little less well-known than NYSERDA, so I'll just ask how many folks would say they're familiar with who we are and what we do. Okay, pretty good. I'll just do a quick primer then. First thing, we are responsible for the reliability of the wholesale bulk high voltage electric system. We've got a control room up in East Greenbush, New York, which is just directly across the river from the state capitol. It's the largest control room of its kind in the country, and that's the nerve center of the entire electric system for the state. So the control room operators you would see there are, in simple terms, balancing load with supply every minute of every day throughout the year, making sure that the amount of electricity is there to serve the demand, and effectively hand off those electrons from the high voltage system to the different distribution systems of the utilities. The second thing that we do is administer and oversee wholesale competitive electric markets, making sure that the market participants in those markets where the commodity is bought and sold are following the rules, and then also making sure that the prices in those wholesale markets are transparent, and helping to drive innovation of the transition. Third thing, major principle or focus of the organization is long-term planning. So we have a lot of very smart planning engineers that all they do every day is pore over data that we get from Con Edison, data we get from NYSERDA, other outlets like Standard & Poor's and Moody's to understand what the econometrics are doing to drive demand and this transition that we're in.
Great, thank you all. This is really good in terms of really just laying the groundwork as from where you all come from and where you're seated around the table, literally, and also just in terms of the industry. And Jen, I'd like to kick it to you to sort of set the scene a little bit more and why it's important to have people from different sectors and different areas here to talk about what we're talking about and have this conversation.
Absolutely. No, thank you all for being here, and thanks for participating. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to engage in this conversation is because really we as a city, as a region, have not seen the amount of electric demand growth on our system that we're seeing today since the 1970s. I think when air conditioners were first introduced was sort of the last major innovation. And as we look around today and we're thinking about electric cars, we're thinking about electric heat and buildings, it really requires a reimagination of the grid and of our systems and of the processes and planning that goes into all of these different delivery systems. And so we are really, I think, at an important point where we know that we have to make these electrification changes. The climate is demanding that we make these changes, and we want to help our customers understand the implications for them, and we want to make sure that the systems and the advocates and the components of the process are all working together in conversation and in alignment to be able to deliver that, because it really is a wholesale change, and it's an important one that we think we have to make.
And Carl, maybe we can start with you in terms of specific questions, but can you paint us the picture of what this electrified future will look like and what it means for the grid? There's a lot of demand that's going to be on it. Show us what it looks like.
Sure, yeah, and Julie did a great job actually of laying out, I think, how the climate crisis is driving our laws, which is driving our need to figure out how to stop burning fossil fuels. And electrification is at the core of that. So NYSERDA and the state have been working on energy efficiency and electrification for many years. And so what does that mean? That means heat pumps in homes and businesses that are taking first to look at energy efficiency and thinking about how they can reduce what that electric load will end up needing to be. So it's really a pairing together of a smaller heating and cooling load and then electrifying that to get fossil fuels out of our systems. And it means electric transportation as a key part of the backbone. That's everything from individual cars to school buses. We recently put out some new funding around electrification of school buses. And so again, that's driving cleaner and getting fossil fuels out of our transportation system. So we've been in this space for many, many years. And it's really through the climate action work that we've done most recently with our scoping plan published at the end of last year that really set our ambition higher based on the climate law. And so what we saw in that scoping plan is that we need, within a decade, millions of individual choices to be made, and we need to foster those choices about moving towards electrification with heat pumps, moving towards electric vehicles. And so we're really talking about transforming, our 20 million folks in the state to be moving towards millions of those purchases. And that's really kind of the level of ambition that we're now seeing, and it needs to happen quickly. And it's unprecedented in terms of its scale. And so we know today that switching to electrification is cleaner than our current use of fossil fuels. But in order to hit those goals that Julie outlined, we really need to massively clean our grid so that electrification isn't just low emission, but it goes to zero emission. And so that means that we need to think in New York City about how we're going to get that energy to the city and supply that from our resources in the state, our upstate wind and solar, our offshore wind. And it's something that we've been critically interested in and thinking about. And we've been dedicated to thinking about how we extend those extension cords, how we get the energy, that clean energy, to New York City. And in the state, we've been poised both in terms of planning and execution. And so planning, there have been a number of really important studies and processes that are underway with the stakeholders around this table. And first through our New York State Power Grid study, where we really articulated what is the vision for a clean grid in 2040 and what do we need to do to get there. We also have been working very closely with our partners, including mostly at the ISO, on our public policy transmission processes. And we have 4 major initiatives, really groundbreaking initiatives that are underway. And we can unpack some of what that means, I think, later. And then the third, more recently, is a coordinated grid planning process, which is really focused on how we get some of those on-ramps to our energy highway. So the public policy transmission needs are the bulk system, it's our electricity highway. We also have to figure out how to get the clean energy onto it so then it can come down to the city. So those are some of the major planning initiatives that we've been working on with obviously a number of other stakeholders, but the state really playing a leadership role there. And then in terms of execution, beyond our public policy needs, we see multiple branches of government executing on building out our transmission needs. So our New York Power Authority plays a critical role. They manage a large portion of our electric grid. What they're working on now today is an upstate upgrade over 100 miles of, again, building out that energy highway to get some of the bottled renewables downstate. We also see processes at the Public Service Commission. So they recently awarded billions of dollars of funds for our utilities to build out local transmission. So those are the on-ramps to get the renewables onto the highway. And we're talking about over 60 individual projects for local transmission processes. So there's been a lot of execution that's been happening. And at NYSERDA, we've also gone beyond thinking about purely bringing on those large-scale renewables on the grid, but thinking about building out our transmission. So we innovated and came up with a new tier to our clean energy standard. And we've now funded 2 large transmission projects that we're bringing energy from Canada and from upstate directly into New York City. Just to give you a sense of scale, these are the Champlain Hudson Power Express and our Clean Path New York. These are gigawatt scale lines, hundreds of miles. Once built this decade, they will be supplying 1/3 of the electricity needs of New York City now. So we're finally talking about projects at scale and the types of investment that we need to make. So it's both planning and execution, and really all of that wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the collaboration that we see around this table of public-private partnership. So we can catalyze those change, but it's the private sector that's actually making them happen.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really in-depth answer that's going to really help guide our discussion moving forward. And just to step back, I mean, with all of this coming on, what will be the demand on the grid as you see it? Maybe you can pick a date in the future and tell me what that looks like and then how it compares to now.
Sure, yeah, and I think there are, as there should be, multiple visions for how this energy transition is going to play out in time. We call them pathways. And our scoping plan put out several different pathways. Our feeling is that we're going to see at least a doubling of the grid in the coming decades. And so that means twice as much energy moving through those wires. And we can do a lot with our existing wires, right? We can upgrade in existing rights of way. We can come up with new technologies that can better utilize that system. But it's going to mean we need more and new infrastructure. And we have to also equally think about how to manage the peak. And so while we're going to double our energy system, we need to be careful and have that be managed electrification and think very creatively and carefully about how we can make sure that that peak doesn't also double. But again, depending on the visions of those futures in the coming decades, one could see even larger growth, especially if we don't have careful management.
Maybe we can go to you, Chris. What kinds of investments are needed as we look forward to getting to this future?
Well, I think we've touched on a couple of them already. We certainly need to invest in our grid to prepare it for the renewables that will come onto the system and really, provide the foundation for being able to decarbonize our economy. So we have the grid, we have renewables, but we also need to really focus on the demand side. As Carl just talked about, we can't just build a bigger and bigger grid and large-scale resources to meet our to address our problems. We're going to need to invest in our buildings, in our transportation sector, in a way so that demand is managed and we can have a very high utilization of the network that we build out. That will enable us to have an affordable future that is cleaner and more resilient than the one we have today.
Jen, do you have others to add?
Well, I was just going to say, as we look at our service territory and think about peak demand going forward, we're also mindful of the fact that we could become a winter peaking utility. And so the sort of dual peaking kind of, currently we really look at summer, the hottest, longest stretches of heat in the summer as being the biggest drivers of demand. And that's because the biggest use of electricity is our air conditioning systems. And that's when the load is at the highest. And so as we electrify heating, we're going to see the coldest stretches start to increase demand. And when you have electric vehicles also pulling and drawing from the grid, and not just your car in your garage, but the MTA buses that need to run and the other systems, we're really looking at a dual peaking system. And I think operationally that will create that will require additional innovations in terms of how we manage the grid from that perspective as well. Because currently many utilities, including Con Edison, use the winter season to make repairs and upgrades and do things on the system. And as we look forward, shortening the windows of opportunity to do that are going to create additional needs.
A couple of years ago, we published something called the System and Resource Outlook, and it's not an official planning study, but we decided that this was necessary in order to understand what are the investment needs to meet the 2030 and 2040 goals. And we're in the process now of updating that. But the report that we issued a couple of years ago showed that we're going to need, in order to meet the 2040 goal and keep the system reliable, that's having enough capacity for production in the system, about 110 gigawatts of capacity. So today we have 37 and a half. That's the scope of the challenge that we need to get to. And then going back to and Carl covered a lot, which is good primer for, I think, understanding the transmission needs as well. So it's great to have offshore wind. We need and we've got the New York City Public Policy Transmission Need actual technical conference happening today up at the NYSO. We've got that focus. If we're citing more terrestrial wind in upstate New York, we have battery storage penetration across the state and here in the city. We're also going to need that transmission investment to move all of those emission-free electrons around. Without the additional highways, we're going to have constraints. We'll have that renewable capacity islanded in various different parts of the state. So it's a matter of, like I said, the scope of getting from here to 110 gigawatts of capacity is making sure that we can keep the system balanced. The demand forecast that we see, we're going to be a winter peaking state around 2032, 2033. There's already upstate regions, communities, areas that are winter peaking today. We saw that transition happening 3-4 years ago. Only 10% of consumers in the state today have electric heat. Now we've got to get to nearly 100% by 2040. So that's the breadth and scope of the challenge, and making sure that we maintain reliability along the way is our focus.
Well, that brings me to my next question, actually. How do we make sure that we maintain reliability? How is that going to happen? I think a lot of times when I hear questions from people who aren't in the industry, but they're hearing a little bit about our electrification goals, they say blackouts are going to happen or brownouts and we won't have enough electricity. And to my understanding, we will. It's just a matter of what kinds of electricity, right, where it comes from. But perhaps you can talk a little bit about that.
The story of the system, the story of the grid has always been one of balance. And if we're doing our job, then we'll maintain that balance because we'll be able to show, and we're doing this with some of the reliability reports that we're issuing now, what's happening with that balance, and then what are the investment needs in order to keep the system reliable. And it's a matter of making sure that we have the resource entry and the incentives to encourage that kind of resource entry and development with the deactivations of the resources we have in place now to serve this increase in demand. In simple terms, that's what we're dealing with.
And so one of the things that I always think about, especially when it comes to NYPA and NYSO, is the story of two grids, right? The downstate grid is mostly powered by fossil fuels, and upstate is cleaner. And so the way to sort of bridge the gap, which I think Carl sort of touched on, is by transmission. So Chris, could you really speak to the role of transmission in this transition?
Transmission is going to be essential. I mean, we need not only a much larger, more sophisticated grid to incorporate all the resources, but we need one that can move the energy all around to where it needs to be. And we also need to make sure that the grid is that much more reliable and resilient than it is today, because we are going to be relying on it to power that much more of our economy. And so the grid is kind of, again, the foundation for a decarbonized economy and all of the benefits from affordability, but also for health and the environment. It's the foundation for enabling it all.
One thing just in terms of the reliability and the balancing of the grid that I think is important to call out is the fact that these are issues of timing. And you're talking about the timing to plan and build and put into service very complicated, advanced technological projects. And you're trying to get that all to happen in the right place at the right time to serve the right customers as people make individual decisions about what electrification they adopt and use on the sort of customer side. And so I think when we talk about the complexity of the transition, and I think we have extremely ambitious goals in this state that are really important to meet the needs of the climate. I think we have a lot of organizations and parts of the system that are completely dedicated to achieving those goals and to getting this right. And I think we still have a really complicated timeline of figuring out how we plug all of these things together and how they work. How they will work over the next 10, 15 years to actually make this a reality. And I think one of the things that we were talking about that we wanted to help people understand is that every choice we make matters in this transition. And as we think about the timing and the sort of processes that are in place to align all of these different aspects of the project, I think really we want to see momentum across the board. We need to see momentum across the board so that there's no part of the system that lags.
And maybe just one other or two other themes on the reliability. So one is a diversification approach. So we need to be thinking about driving our system have multiple resources at its base. Some people often ask, why are we potentially paying incrementally more for certain resources? And the answer is that we can't just rely on one type. And so we see complementarity between offshore wind and solar, and we see complementarity between different scales of energy storage, and we also need to be thinking about our distribution system and thinking about distributed energy resources. And so that's why we have a portfolio of resources, why we drive New York Sun to bring our community solar to the grid, while we drive offshore wind now and not wait for it to necessarily have cost parity with solar. So that's kind of one theme of diversification. The other is the important role of the ISO, right? As the independent system operator, they're the ones waking up every morning thinking about how the reliability of the system can be run. And they've done an amazing job and continue to do great planning. And even the work they've done to do wind forecasting has enabled us to bring more wind than we could have imagined in the early years of this transition. And so there's both innovation and kind of new operations approaches that our independent system operators doing.
Carl makes a great point about the state of the future system, which is going to be more flexible. It has to be more distributed, and we didn't really see major changes in the system in the grid for roughly 100 years after it was constructed, and now we're trying to change it within 20. We're going from central station, big generating units, to smaller scale, now intermittent, different technology, inverter-based resources, and we don't have a lot of data on how those inverter-based resources would respond under certain conditions in different weather, which means we're going to have to identify new technology that can help fill in some of the gaps when there is a disturbance on the system. And so that's also where NYSERDA comes in and helping driving that innovation, because ultimately we will have a need for fast ramping resources, different technologies, as Carl said, that could be green and blue hydrogen based, could be small scale nuclear. I know that sounds right now sort of otherworldly. And then we have to keep our minds open to what artificial intelligence innovation may do and help with the future state of the system.
Let's put a pin in that, because I want to get to innovation too at the end when we think about the future, which is closer, I think, than we even imagine. But we've been talking a lot about sort of the intermix between the state and what's happening in the city. And now I kind of want to zoom into the city and look really at the grid here. And we mentioned a lot about the investments that are needed into the grid. But let's dive in on that. Let's really get specific. So Jen, maybe we can start with you about what is Con Ed doing to invest in the grid?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing is the resiliency of the system. And so after Hurricane Sandy, we invested over $1 billion in hardening our system. So the sort of cost of inaction here is the cost of resiliency investments. And we're seeing those pay off. During the deluge recently, we had really very low outages across our system. It held up extremely well. And so those are serving customers. We're also preparing for the transmission needs that were talked about. We built a 6-mile transmission line from our Rainey substation in Long Island City, Queens, out to Corona, really to move power, bulk power, to other parts of our system, so that as we get clean energy injections, we're able to get that to more households. And then we broke ground this year on the Brooklyn Clean Energy Hub, which is a substation in Vinegar Hill, Brooklyn, that's going to allow for 1,500 megawatts of clean energy to plug into our system there from the offshore wind. So a lot of investment happening to both serve customers and to take the clean energy into the grid and move it around in a way that's efficient and effective for where we're seeing demand.
And I'm curious, I mean, obviously Con Ed is investing in battery storage, but Carl, I'd love to hear more about why we need energy storage in general and what that looks like.
Sure, yeah. So I think, as everyone knows, there's a unique attribute of the grid where we have to amazingly simultaneously use, right, every bit of energy as it is instantly produced. And we have incredible amount of human capital and information technology capital to make sure that that system balances. So one of the kind of secrets of what we can do to unpack some of that challenge is through energy storage. And we have a long history of energy storage in the state. We have pumped hydro facilities that were built decades ago. And in those days, it was to balance out our nuclear plants that had to run at a level, flat place. And so that pumped hydro and the run-of-river hydro systems that we have could help to fluctuate and build. We have in law now a goal of 3 gigawatts of energy storage. So you heard the magnitude of our system now is around 30 gigawatts. And we think that's our starting point. When we look at our scoping plan and look at how the grid may double into the future, we think we're going to need short duration storage on the order of 20 gigawatts. So an order of magnitude more than we already have in our system. We will have decades to build that out. And why do we need that short duration storage? It's for those second by second, minute by minute operations and the services that the grid needs. It's also to help spread out and balance some of our solar and wind so that as the sun sets, we have an ability to shift some of that energy just a few hours as people come home and turning on lights and plugging in cars. So we see that there's a need for that short duration storage, both for grid services and balancing out the system, as well as spreading our resources. And we also need long duration storage. So that's some of the innovation that Kevin spoke to. And we don't know exactly what that's going to be. NYSERDA has actually made an award recently to a new type of metal air battery that will be able to be sited in New York and will be half a day's worth of energy storage, so much longer than our current battery systems, but hydrogen may also play a role for long duration storage, and we're going to also need that at tens of gigawatt scale. So we're really talking about innovation and investment of orders of magnitude more than we've done. The good news is that we're already started, right? So we're building battery storage systems now. We're building on the legacy of our pumped hydro systems, and we're doing new technology and getting it into the field so that we can start to test out today what we're going to be needing in 15 years.
Kevin, I'd love to jump to you. If you can just speak about sort of what's needed to site all of the new substations and power lines and all the other like actual physical infrastructure we need to really let the grid handle this increased load.
It's a little outside of our purview. So I guess, and maybe
Jen can help.
And maybe Jen can talk about this, but we are very cognizant of the fact that, especially with transmission infrastructure, there's the likelihood of having to build or expand new substations. Where do those go? How do those operate in the future? Additionally, in terms of siting, we also are paying close attention when we are receiving and poring over some of the proposals inside of the PPTN process. What are the infrastructure?
You're acronyming. Can you define?
What? I'm sorry?
You're giving an acronym.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, too many acronyms in this industry. Public Policy Transmission Need Process, which, if you're not familiar, is initiated by the Public Service Commission. If they identify that there's a public policy need for additional transmission investments somewhere in the state, then we step in after a public comment period to help look at all the proposals to build that transmission. And so one of the things that we do pay attention to is what difficulty do these project proposals contemplate with regards to the siting. But I'll pitch it back over to Jen.
Yeah, I would say I think from our perspective, as we look at building out transmission, it's really helping the local community where we need to site these facilities, helping them understand how we came to choose particular routes, what those routes mean to the ability to actually deliver on the transition, and then how they ultimately impact the local community. And from a construction perspective in terms of when we're there, and from an ongoing operational perspective for the duration of the time the infrastructure's in place. And that's really a dialogue, and it's about understanding the local community, being involved and committed to the local community, which is something we invest a significant amount of time and resources into. And then operationally, I think it's really working with the agencies and in New York City with the city on the permitting process, which can be onerous and slow and not built for this. Those processes are not built for the velocity that we're going to need to realize in order to actually make this a reality. And so in many cases we get the project may be approved, it may be ready to go, we may be off and running, and we get held up in a stage that's really oversight and advisory, which is important, but it's also important to be able to accelerate that to the extent reasonable to make sure that we can make this stuff actually happen. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I think all that's right. And I certainly think that a lot of the processes, including the regulatory processes for siting, permitting, interconnection, were not designed for the scale of new resource integration that we are going to be seeing. And so we need to do our best to make those processes more efficient, and we got to get ahead of it too. So we need to be pre-building out the grid so that the grid is ready to incorporate the renewables when they come onto the system. So we're not building out the grid as each kind of tranche of renewables comes online, because that will be slower. We need to proactively engage with communities so that they are wrestling with what it means to have new types of resources in their communities, and they can think about that in a lower pressure way than when there is one or competing projects that are trying to enter their community. So we have a lot to do to get ahead of some of these things and to really communicate the benefits and what it means to the communities where these resources will be.
And maybe just building from that briefly, I mean, I think the other aspect is, because of the challenges of siting, we need to be thinking about each individual touch point and how to maximize the benefit from that. So Con Ed's Clean Energy Hub is a brilliant example where they got approval to build it out, to strengthen their system and to get more offshore wind, but they've been thinking ahead and saying, how can we expand this project so in the future it can do more and we can see 3 times as much offshore wind coming into that same location. So these opportunities are only going to come, once a decade when we think about these types of long-term infrastructure. So we have to maximize them. The public policy transmission need, we're also looking for New York City. How can we have a coordinated build-out of that extension cord out into the water so we can maximize that very thin area through our narrows to get as much power through? And again, we're going to have one shot at really building that out in a really coherent way, and that's why it was so brilliant for it to go forward through the public policy transmission need. So it wasn't being done radially piecemeal by individual developers, but we had a plan and coordinated build-out of that space.
I think Carl might have mentioned it earlier too, beyond the PPTN. The governor also announced a project to look forward at a meshed network, which is also going to be critical as we anticipate more and more of that capacity. I'll just share one quick anecdote going back to, because I think Chris made an important point. We're in New York City, and I was on Saturday at another event up in Columbia County and sat on a panel there. And there were a couple of farmers on this panel. And at once, almost in the same breath, they said, climate change is ruining my business. One farmer told stories about how his pumpkins are getting sunburn in October. And in the same breath, though, they're saying, but we don't want any more of the solar. Not here, not in this county, not on my farm, not on my property, not in my backyard. So it's that kind of cognitive dissonance and conflict that I think we also have to pay some close attention to.
We're going to speak more about communities and sort of like on the ground impacts in a second, but I just want to go back to what Chris had raised about the inefficiencies and sort of slowness and the big process that you have to go through that's sort of not as accelerated as we need it to be. And I'm curious, if we can start with you, just what is needed to really speed that up? And if others have some quick thoughts, we can hear them as well.
Well, I will start by saying that process is important. We're talking about long-lived infrastructure that's supposed to be around for decades, and if we build that infrastructure right, we are going to set ourselves up for a great future. But if we build it wrong, then that infrastructure becomes kind of anchor that's kind of weighing us and pulling us down. And we've seen this across the country where, and I imagine this has even happened in New York, where there are things that were never built that customers have been paying for generations. I started my career in Washington State, where there was a bunch of nuclear plants that they tried to build, and then they just got so expensive and they got abandoned. And for decades and decades, customers are going to be paying for those. So we need to avoid those kinds of challenges. Again, I think proactive engagement is key, figuring out how to make the processes simpler, more efficient, more flexible. We certainly need just people power in terms of people working at places like the NYSO and Con Ed and on siting boards and things like that, just to help work through the amount of applications that are coming through.
I would maybe add to that. I think the human resources is extremely important. I think a lot of the agencies that oversee this are not staffed to the level that they need to be in order to process, again, the velocity and scale of applications and things that are going to be coming through. I also think interagency coordination is really important, and I think having a clear sense of priority around what everyone is accountable to. We see this at the city level where, we get stipulations to build something and you get 3 work hours a day for 6 months. And, maybe we need to have 8 work hours a day for 1 month, and that can help accelerate some of the building and get things done. And I think, engaging, having a forum to engage in those and having the people at the agency level who are accountable for it really understand these impacts on the overall process, I think is also going to be important going forward.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add that, we've had, heaven forbid, these two words together, but innovation and bureaucratic processes, but we've had a little bit. And we've kind of moved beyond some of what used to be our traditional so-called Article 10 process of siting large facilities. It was really built around the system as it was, large fossil plants, not many. We have a new siting office and looking at how we can accelerate and have the kind of the hundreds of projects that have to come through get cited. So there is more coordination happening, can be improved. I'll also say the interconnection process is one that we're continuously thinking of reforming, and I've spent some time the past couple of years at the federal level looking across the country at the different RTOs and ISOs, and I would say New York has been a leader, and the ISO has been a leader at thinking about its interconnection process. If it's hard here, there's many other areas where it's twice as hard. But we need to continue to refine and reform and think about how we can have more batch processes and think about how we can have faster and more continuous interconnection process. Because again, the volume is only increasing and we have to pivot into a system that we hadn't envisioned even 15 years ago. And part of that's also obviously about human resources, as was mentioned, and we need to definitely add those so we can increase our rate at which we can process some of this work.
And just to sort of step back for a second and locate us where we are in this kind of mandated process and these goals that we have. Are we on track to get there? Where are we?
Well, I guess I can start off with that fun question. So I think we've seen throughout the country large infrastructure projects have been hitting a number of challenges, right? And so there's kind of a perfect storm of both high inflation, supply chain disruptions, which have both been caused by both the pandemic and the global geopolitical crises that we are facing. Coupled with that is higher interest rates, right? So those 3 things are a perfect storm for anything that's capital intensive. And our clean energy projects have not been immune to that. And so, what have we done in response as we've seen some of these challenges is we've taken a step back and realized we have to adapt our programs and shift gears. And so you've seen just very recently a large award of both offshore wind and land-based resources that are reflecting this new reality of these cost structures. As we took a look at that portfolio, it's actually the largest state procurement in our nation's history of renewable energy. We're accelerating our solicitations at the state level, which can allow for some of these projects that might be under threat because of the current situation that was outside of their control to rebid and be able to potentially move forward under a new contractual construct. So both doubling down on the solicitations and the awards we've made, and then accelerating our solicitations to make sure that those projects, which are so critical in terms of the timeline that they're on, so they can keep moving forward. But it's not just about putting out incentives. It's also about thinking about how to bring that supply chain in-state, so we're less vulnerable to the outside. Recently, GE has announced they're looking at building blade production manufacturing in-state. It's also about building that workforce. And so we're moving forward on a number of different fronts. One example on Long Island, we have an offshore wind training institute, which is putting millions of dollars into building that human capital in the state so that we aren't slowed down because of a lack of workforce. So we have certainly headwinds and challenges. Our goals are still within reach, but we have to be adaptive and innovative as we deal with this kind of triad of unexpected challenges that we faced.
Kevin, do you have thoughts? You're smirking.
Well, I shouldn't be, because Carl outlined a lot of the challenges, and when I listened to Carl talk, I realized how closely the NYSERDA and the NYSO are working together, because we don't want to gloss over the supply chain issues, which are tremendous. And I feel for Carl and Doreen Harris, who runs NYSERDA, who are responsible for pushing the development, and then when we talk to developers and we look at some of the data out there, and we realize getting submarine cable is like hitting the lottery these days. It's that difficult, made more difficult by things you don't expect, like the war in Ukraine, which started this tremendous investment in Europe to in the future avoid Gazprom reliance. And Europe right now, led probably by National Grid, is building as fast as possible and making investments as fast as possible in bidirectional interconnections between certain European countries. So the ability to get material before you even have the financing, all those questions laid out is tremendously difficult these days. And Carl, last thing I'll say is Carl mentioned the interconnection process. And that strikes me, so we oversee that, coordinate that. It is really an all hands on deck approach to solving all of these problems, despite whatever's happening globally. And we have hired more engineers so that we can apply more human capital to the process. We are looking at every possible way to create efficiencies within the process that we don't have to bring down to FERC and get approved through the regulatory process. And then there are those changes that we know we're going to have to bring to FERC that we're working on as fast as possible inside of the governance process, because there's so many folks here that are aware of the NYSO, and so I assume you're aware of the governance process, where every stakeholder is represented, and getting a proper solution, one that's aggressive and is going to be workable through the governance process down to FERC as fast as possible.
There's 2 points that Carl made that I would like to highlight. First is the importance of bringing supply chain to New York. New York has embarked on this clean energy transformation, not just to solve climate change. We're not going to do it ourselves, but we can kind of blaze the trail and show how it's going to be done and that it can be done. But we embarked on this also to bring benefits to New Yorkers, and that includes the jobs and the economic development that will come from bringing some of these industries into New York, and us being kind of first movers there, which will enable us to support the clean energy transition of the states up and down the East Coast. The other thing I wanted to just touch on was the challenge of something like inflation. The estimates out there are that somewhere around a third of the inflation has been driven by fossil-fueled energy costs. And so the challenges that everyone in this room has experienced, the rising prices that everyone in this room has experienced, are being driven by our dependence on fossil fuels. And as we shift our economy away from those fossil fuels, which are, the prices of them are very volatile and subject to, global politics, we will stabilize our costs and make our future more affordable.
That's a good point to keep in mind, I think. And so just to transition a little bit to community impacts, Kevin raised the idea of farmers that are being NIMBYs for something that could actually maybe help them out. although there are challenges. Jen also brought up the fact of doing community outreach. So I'm curious about the community concerns, environmental justice concerns, but also the benefits that are here and could manifest with this transition. Anyone can start.
Well, I'll start. We're here in New York City, and I don't think there's anywhere in this state where the operational challenges of our climate laws and the equity challenges of our climate laws converge. New York City is one of the biggest load centers, if not the biggest in the country, scattered across a couple islands with transmission constraints all around it. And because of that, we have local capacity requirements that basically means that we have to site the generation, the vast majority of the generation we need to keep the lights on at the most critical times. They have to be right here in the city. And so we have some of the dirtiest, most polluting plants across the entire state are right here in New York City, where many of the people are. And that infrastructure tends to be located in communities of color and communities that have been disproportionately burdened by our energy system for too long. So, we have both an opportunity but also a mandate to address that and to ensure that we're doing it in a way that does not continue to disproportionately burden the communities that have been historically disadvantaged, and to do it in a way where we are delivering clean energy solutions to those folks while also enhancing their reliability and comfort. I think one of the best ways to do that is actually through the manner in which we electrify our end uses and our buildings, because this is an opportunity to make New Yorkers the actual owners of clean energy solutions. I mean, you put a new heating system in your building is now more comfortable to be in. It is cleaner, and it has more value for the building owner.
Yeah, no, love to build on that a little bit, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of environmental justice. I think when we listen and hear kind of what are some of the concerns of various communities around the state, it's about access to resources, right? How are we investing in all communities and bringing those clean energy options to all communities? So, how can all communities be involved and not left behind as they have in the past? Energy affordability is kind of a second loud issue that we hear about, and how are we making sure that the cost of this transitions are kind of being spread in a way that reflects what the energy burden is on households. And the third one, which is I think often overlooked, is about the process itself. So how do we have an inclusive process that brings all the voices to the table? And that last one, we by law, and the first and last, by law and in the Climate Act, have to invest resources in disadvantaged communities, at least 35% with a goal of 40%. The law also stipulated that we have a climate justice working group that was working very closely with our Climate Action Council to bring those voices to the table. And another example very recently is in that grid planning process that I spoke about that was just approved by the Commission. We have environmental justice voices at the table for that grid planning, which haven't historically been included. And it's about getting those voices early in the process and not waiting till projects are in the final stages when they can't be changed and can't be shifted. And there's other opportunities that I would love to talk about, but we can do that next.
And I would just add, I think also one aspect that Con Edison has been focused on is actually supporting environmental justice organizing within communities, and so helping to support organizations at the very hyper-local level that can engage in those processes, because a lot of engagement in the process is onerous. It's time-intensive, it's very technical, and making sure that local communities have the access to the expertise and support that they need to be properly represented, I think, is an important aspect as well.
And one thing I do want to bring up, Chris had raised the idea of how dirty some of the infrastructure in and around the city is, and one thing is peaker plants, and those are highly polluting power plants that usually fire when there's a high demand, like in the summer. And NYSO, I believe, just had a report, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, saying that a couple of those plants will actually stay on longer than they were expected to because of a gap in reliability that we would see. Kevin, can you maybe talk about that and maybe speak to how it's an example of where this transition is getting a little sticky and where the benefits are for doing it right?
Yeah, so our planning reports that I mentioned at the outset had been showing for the last couple of years a degradation of what we call reliability margins, and this really is surplus of megawatts in the system to serve the demand in those unforeseen circumstances when, for instance, you have extreme weather or a transmission line is no longer available or a plant unexpectedly goes down. And started to signal maybe a year ago that the reliability margins that we saw in New York City were getting dangerously close to being in violation with some reliability rules. And then lo and behold, in July, we issued a quarterly assessment of reliability that showed that we did in fact cross zero, and we were at a deficit of 436 megawatts beginning in the summer of 2025 for a 9-hour period of time that our modeling showed we weren't able at a grid level to serve demand in the city. This is sort of a good news, bad news story in that part of what drove that was the unavailability of roughly 1,200 megawatts of peaker plants that were either chose to go offline, mothball, retire, or were no longer going to be available in the summer. So that's a good news story in that the policy is working, driving the dirtiest, most inefficient units off of the system. But then also, we do see some rise in demand in the city driven by electrification adoption. And so there's about a 12-month period of time where we see that gap, that 436 megawatt deficit. Champlain-Hudson comes online and electrifies in the summer of 2026, helps to fill that gap. In the meantime, and this is pursuant to some emissions regulations that the DEC put together a few years ago, we said that the Narrows and Gowanus barges in Brooklyn were necessary to fill that gap in the event that we have some extreme demand on the system. So these are units, as you said, that we only run as a last resort, would only depend on when the heat index and the demand is at a certain level. And we're going to keep a careful watch on how much those run on a moving forward basis, working very closely with Champlain-Hudson to make sure that they stay on schedule with electrifying the city, and then looking very closely at the demand trends to understand when exactly we don't need those units anymore. Pursuant to the DEC rule, the second phase under that rule, we can exit the rest of the remainder of the plants.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And I also just want to remind people about the index cards that you're holding or sitting on. If you did write something on them, please pass them over to the League of Conservation Voters staff that are on the edge right here. We'll take a look at those shortly. And in the meantime, I have a few maybe faster, I wouldn't want to say lightning round because I would love some context, but some questions for all of you. And one is, we'll go negative, then we'll go positive, but what keeps you up at night regarding this transition, regarding what work that you're doing and that you're coordinating with others? What are sort of the biggest challenges that are on your mind that are, worrying you?
Sure, I can go first, and I'm not known for my lightning, but I will do my best. I think Kevin's story is a good news story because it shows the role that we can play of building out long-term transmission to meet the needs to get peakers out of the city, and that the ISO has their hand, on the wheel to make sure the lights are staying on. But it's the timing question that really keeps me up. It's that these projects are massive, and we can lay out a brilliant plan that can say for the next 15 years, how are we going to build that infrastructure? But then we have unexpected challenges, which are going to push us off our timelines. So how do we build into that the kind of adaptive system that Kevin and DEC, ISO and DEC work through, so that if we have a 12-month gap, we're going to keep the lights on and keep things going. So it's that challenge of laying out highly uncertain because infrastructure is hard, but having an adaptive approach that can make sure we can fill those gaps.
Maybe building on that, what keeps me up at night is really, can the bureaucracy meet the moment? Can we evolve our systems?
Yes, we can.
Right, we will. But I think that's the challenge for me, is because that takes coordination. It takes pushing on systems that are really calcified in some ways. And I think the good news is that I think there are a lot of people in those spots that want to be innovative and want to push forward. And I think really harnessing that power is going to be important.
I think for me, one of the main things is how are we going to keep up the political will to meet the moment and stay focused on the benefits and overcome the kind of army of opposition out there that has financial interests in maintaining the status quo and are highly organized and dumping millions and millions of dollars into resources into trying to undermine our clean energy transition. I mean, there has been, those groups have created kind of front groups and have been astroturfing New Yorkers. They've been working to change the law and going about other kind of media and public relation campaigns to convince New Yorkers that this is too expensive and too difficult and we need to slow down and or not do it. And I'll say Con Ed has not been a part of that group, so that's good news. We have one of our biggest utilities in the state that seems to be really on board to moving us forward. But I think we need to figure out ways and to communicate the benefits and really make sure that we are. We also have to make sure that folks are seeing and feeling the benefits, kind of not after they are feeling costs that are driving the transition. So we have to make sure that the positive aspects are really at the forefront and highlighted, and we're not only highlighting the challenges.
Very quickly, it's what Carl said and what Chris said. One, maintaining that balance that I keep talking about, additions and uprates, what we call uprates. We're seeing the imbalance. We see a trend, and the amount of resource additions. So it's maintaining that balance for reliability purposes. And then also as myself and my team, we're very cognizant of what Chris is talking about. We do not want to be misinterpreted in the communications that we put together. Even though the reliability reports, we have to communicate the details that are in there. We have to show that the data is trending a certain way. And that we hope drives decisions, the best decisions we can make about the policies. And so part of what keeps me up at night, and Chris keeps us honest on this, is not being misinterpreted as trying to communicate that we're going to pause or that we think we should pause or stop, but make smart investment decisions that maintain reliability. And if you look at the mission of the organization, it does acknowledge that the law of the land and the statute is the CLCPA, and we feel a responsibility, one, to maintaining reliability, but also helping the state achieve these goals.
Okay, now for some sunnier question. What is an example of innovation or something else that makes you positive and gives you some optimism in terms of where we're going and how we're getting there?
I can start. I think I'll start with something that might not be talked about by the rest of them, but something that gives me optimism is how advanced our information technologies are and how little they are utilized actually on the grid. thus far today. I think your average person across the state would be shocked at how analog some of our energy systems really are, given how pervasive communication technologies are in every other part of our life. And so we really have some great opportunities to leverage those technologies to make our demand flexible, to make it so someone in a control room with the permission of the customer can, turn down your heat a degree or two. We can delay charging on your electric vehicle so it doesn't charge the minute you come home, but charges a little bit later, through the night when demand is low. We have so many kind of low-cost opportunities to make our system smarter and more efficient and ultimately better.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I would say what sort of keeps me enthusiastic is kind of looking out at this room, looking at this panel, hearing Julie talk about the years and decades that she's been at this advocacy work, and really feeling like we are in a minute of extreme change, and we're seeing things happen, and the momentum is here, and the law is clear, and I think I feel a lot of enthusiasm around our ability to execute and to start to make some of these impacts really feel real to people.
Yeah, maybe 3 quick ones. One is that renewable energy still is something that across the U.S. people can get behind, and they see from their own vantage place where they're coming from, they see themselves in it, whether it be jobs that are going to be created in having local energy, whether it be climate crisis, whether it be the fact that we've seen these incredible cost declines, and now Midwestern wind is the cheapest resource that we have in the country. So that's certainly optimism. What we see at the federal level from the IRA, just the incredible amount of resources, the billions of dollars are going to be invested in our clean energy system, gives me optimism. And now it's about how do we take advantage of it. So I've been doing a bunch of analytic work at the federal level, and it was at first, before the IRA, how are we going to build out our nation's transmission and clean energy system in order to kind of drive those opportunities. Now it's how do we take advantage of the IRA and unlock that resource. So that's definitely giving me a lot of optimism for the whole country.
Last week, we this is part of the benefit about working at the ISO. You get loads of this data. We broke a wind production record last week for the state. The one prior to that was less than 30 days before that, at the beginning of November. And every spring for the last 3 years at least, we see a behind-the-meter solar production record as well. And in this spring, we broke 3 records. So broke a record from the year prior, and then increased solar production twice through the spring. Why in the spring? Well, 1, the sun is out, but then 2, the leaves are off of the trees, so there's less obstruction. Probably would have been even greater had we not had to deal with the smoke and the fires up in Canada. The other thing that gives me optimism is if you look at what the Biden administration just did in the last few days in coordination with COP, they have set the social cost of carbon at $190. I'll just leave that there.
That's great. I mean, more good things than we can talk about right now. So I'll do a few questions from here and see what we've got for time. I'm just going to choose them at random, kind of, but let's see. Is the cost of transition sustainable to keep, I can't quite read this, BIPOC, fixed income seniors, single income households on board with the transition? Maybe someone can speak to that. I know we talked a little bit about the energy burden. I think Carl had brought that up earlier.
Yeah, so I can talk about it a bit. I mean, so we're going to have to be spending billions of dollars, and so the question is how we spend those. We spend over $20 billion every year right now on our electricity system. We have another $10 billion in natural gas. So, what we found in the scoping plan that 90% of the effort is redirecting those existing investments, And then that incremental percent that we're going to have to spend in billions, we have to figure out carefully how we're going to spread that burden. And there are a number of different mechanisms that came out of our scoping plan. One might be a cap and invest, where we have the polluters capped and have those polluters pay, and then we reinvest those resources. So the question that we have to make sure is, as the Public Service Commission has been putting forward, are there going to be energy burden limits so that our lowest income communities can be made sure that they aren't spending too much? When we take those investments back from a potential cap and invest, we're going to be rebating some of those resources. We have to make sure those rebates are done in a progressive way. So those who have a higher energy burden get more of that percentage rebate back. And then when we're investing those billions, making sure that those communities aren't being left behind. Because what we found is that if you're transitioning to electricity under that potential future cap and invest with that rebate, you could actually come out as a net saving, because you're getting off of the fossil fuels that are now burdened with those extra carbon costs, switching to cleaner resources, and then we're still giving out those rebates to make households whole. So it's definitely a matter of a redirection of our existing resources and making sure that that incremental cost is one that we can shape in a progressive way.
I think those are all really great points. I think also helping customers understand what's happening to their total energy cost. When they start charging their car at home, that shows up on their electric bill, but they're no longer going to the gas station. And so I think also just really there's a communications challenge with some of these communities. In addition to the work that needs to be done to sort of make it equitable, it's also about helping people understand how their consumer behavior is changing.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that is we do need to change how, kind of how costs hit customers, how the costs of the infrastructure that we need is recovered. Just a couple of examples, but like depreciation is one opportunity we have where we could shift the way we recover the costs of long-lived assets to, instead of just kind of recovering the same amount for those in every year, we recover them based on the amount of energy that's pushed through the system in the years. And so that will enable, for example, as our energy system, our electric system grows to 3 times the size it is today, we can match more of that cost recovery to when that system is going to be greater utilized. And so that would help address some of the intergenerational kind of cost challenges and ease some of the cost that people are feeling up front. And then I also think, as Carl mentioned, it's essential to keep in mind how much money we're already spending on the energy system and how much of that money is going to things that are just making the transition harder. I mean, there are still parts of our law, despite the Climate Act, that are promoting and subsidizing the expansion of our fossil fuel networks. And doing so in a way that is only going to increase the costs that are stranded on New Yorkers in the future. So we need to change some policies to address it, but we can manage the affordability challenges that we're facing.
And just follow up on that. What's being done to ensure that communities of color are not left behind in this as well?
I think we do a lot of outreach within our service territory with communities. I mentioned we've been investing in supporting social justice organizations at the grassroots level. We also have a philanthropic arm of our organization that invests in a lot of sustainable organizations and people focused on advocating around climate change. And then also I think it's it's a story about also hiring and making sure that jobs, the clean energy jobs of the future that we need at Con Edison. We're 14,000 people that we're hiring from the communities in our service territory, and that we're sort of recycling the economic value of the investments that are made within our system back into the communities that we serve.
Yeah, and you know, if you've looked at the map of our disadvantaged communities, which was an outcome of our scoping plan, you'll see that there's a lot of alignment with the historically disadvantaged folks by definition, and a lot of those are folks of color. And so we are seeing the opportunity now by law, it's mandating putting resources into those communities. So a couple of examples, we have Solar for All, which is both the state and federal funding, where millions of dollars are being put into community-based solar programs, but targeting our disadvantaged communities, both low income and communities of color, to make sure that access to solar, not necessarily on your roof if you can't put it, but through the grid and through your local network. So that's one, is our Solar for All program. Second one is our Green Bank. So we've stood up recently a $250 million new initiative that's looking to get funding to community-based, mission-driven lenders. And so to buy down the risk so they can invest in their local disadvantaged communities through energy efficiency, building upgrades, so making both lower energy footprint, lower bills for those communities, and healthier homes. So those are two examples, and there are a number of them. And again, driven by law, we're now investing our resources in this area.
I've got a very specific question here, and it speaks to, sounds like Local Law 97 concerns. It's been hard to convince my residential co-op to electrify heating because we've been told Con Ed might not be able to guarantee that power will be available. How do we plan around that?
Well, whoever submitted that should find us afterwards and we can work through this. But power definitely will be available to ensure that people can comply with Local Law 97. We've been working very closely with the City Department of Buildings and other agencies within the city to help communicate with customers about the investments that they need to make to help make resources available to support them in making those investments and to do it on a schedule that works with the compliance required under the law. There's a New York City accelerator, a sort of one-stop shop for all of the information and access to the tools that people need to be able to comply, and we've been encouraging folks to use that. And we also have a team at Con Edison that does significant outreach to individual building owners, meets with co-op boards, et cetera. But I think it speaks to the sort of complexity of some of these local laws and the lack of understanding on the customer side about what's available to help them with this transition and how important it is for them to take individual action in order to make this a reality. And so I think really we've been trying to promote and increase access to those resources and to that information.
And somewhat related as well about customer choices, can you talk about the practical impacts individual customers will face in the transition and what it means to their households and businesses? So I think in the very beginning of this discussion, we talked about how every choice matters and it's going to take millions of people making choices to go towards electrification. So yeah, if someone can sort of flesh that out.
Just to jump in on that one as well, I think, in New York City is a particular place also because many people are renters. If you're a homeowner and you can put solar on your roof, that's a choice you can make. If you want to buy an electric car and put a charger in your garage or next to your house, I think those are things that feel like they're fairly straightforward given where we are and within your control. And I think if you talk about the co-op board aligning all of your community around the resources or the actions that they need to take, or if you're in a big development where there's a management company or somebody else is making those kinds of decisions. And I think that's where I think really people need to, these laws were created by elected leaders, and I think we need to do a lot more outreach to help people understand what they can do, why it's important to them. And ultimately, this is about controlling climate change. It's about creating healthier, more sustainable environments. It's about communities being more hardened and sustainable against the impacts of climate change that are happening all around us, and our responsibility to help reverse those. And I think amplifying that message and getting that out and having people connect with that on a personal level is really important.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback on some of that. So in terms of individual actions, totally agree. If you can't put solar on your roof, we are the nation's leader in community solar today. So I encourage everyone to think about how they and their local communities can find local solar that they can subscribe to. If you drive, we have now every year more and more opportunities for new models of electric vehicles. I think we together are already seeing double-digit sales rates for EVs, and this is the decade of the EV, but we have to collectively come together to make that happen. And if you ride an electric subway, which is the oldest electric transportation I think we have in the country, keep doing it, right? We have to continue to support public transit. In terms of building electrification, we've seen that there are opportunities that each of us will have to make decisions. If you're thinking about upgrading your cooling or even adding cooling to your home, it's an opportunity to get a cold climate heat pump and make sure you're getting that so that you can actually get heating benefit from that same unit. And with efficiency and a heat pump, you can pay less, especially if you have oil. And so looking for those opportunity moments, because they will come, but once a decade, and taking advantage of those key decisions as individuals to be able to do a little more research and find out how to expand that. And if you can't replace your stove, get a small induction cooktop oven. They work great. I mean, a small hot plate and test it out and see how it works to cook on induction. So I think there are lots of incremental ways. And then maybe just to zoom out, for the groups that you are a part of and you are an activist as part of, we need to continue to think about how we can get to yes. Right? So we're going to need you all to continue to advocate for more public funding to drive that public-private partnership that we've seen. We're going to need you to get to yes on helping to support siting of clean generation, of storage, and transmission. Right? So I hope we all walk away from this thinking about where can I find a yes in my work that I'm going to be doing.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like we've run out of time. We have so many other questions I'd love to get to, but we can't right now. But this is my job. I answer these questions for a living as a reporter. So please come find me online, or I have some cards around, and I'd love to use these as jumping off points for stories, and can use these folks as sources that will answer the questions. Again, so thank you so much for coming. I would love to turn it back over to Leah from the League of Conservation Voters. Really appreciate your time today, and all of yours as well.
Thank you all.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah. I'm the Director of Community and Civic Engagement at the New York League of Conservation Voters. And I just want to say a big thank you again to Samantha, to all the panelists, Kevin, Carl, Jen, Chris, and to Con Ed, as well as AIA for making this event happen. We're hoping to do a lot more of events like this in the future about the transition. We had a webinar last week about offshore wind that you can check out if you're interested. We're planning an event on battery storage, and hopefully can really continue this conversation. So please feel free to come up afterwards. Again, as Samantha mentioned, if there are questions, we would also be happy to talk more about them. But again, thank you to everyone, to these wonderful speakers for making this happen.